How do, and welcome back. Let me just put this more central and then I'm in the middle. There we go. How do, welcome back. So today I'm going to be doing a quick review of Pilsner Urquell, but I'm also going to be talking about its history and probably break a few myths. Definitely it's the beer that changed the beer world, but there's a lot of legend, a lot of myth, and I hope to explain that. Let's get this open and get it into a glass, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. Whoops. Beautiful CO2 coming off. I'm using my styrofoam glass. I don't have a Pilsner glass, or Pilsner Urquell glass. I thought the styrofoam would be more in keeping though, as it's a Czech beer. And yes, there it is. Nice frothy, compact, pure white head. Beautiful golden beer. And already I'm smelling those sours, hops, that grassiness, the lemon. Oh, it's a wonderful, wonderful beer. Or the aroma is. Let's go for a taste. Cheers. The secret to Pilsner Urquell is to find a fresh bottle. I often find you're safer going to one of the small independent Polish shops than you are going to a big supermarket. I picked this up this morning at a Polish shop, and that is really nice. Much better than what I get from a supermarket, and I think it's just to do with age. The supermarkets, of course, they've got the distribution centres. How long have they been there? Hops don't last long over time, and I just find that I get a much more pleasant, much fresher beer when I go to a little small independent Polish shop than I do when I go to a supermarket. Sometimes I've had Pilsner Urquell from a supermarket, and it must have been that old, it hasn't really tasted any different from a normal generic lager. The hops have just died away, but this is beautiful, really nice and grassy, lemony, bit of spice on the back end, nice pleasant bitterness, but there's also that nice little sweet malty flavour there as well. Beautiful beer. Now, a lot of myth is built up around this beer. It was first brewed in 1842, and it was in September, late September 1842, and it was first served in early November of 1842. And many lager aficionados will be saying, well, that's not long from brew day to serving. And it wasn't. It was only matured for about 1 month. They did two versions of the beer. They used the Plato scale, so it was 10-degree version and a 12-degree version. This is equivalent to about 4% and a 5% beer. The one that was actually served in November of 1842 was the 4%. And it had been conditioned for 1 month. The 12%, the 12 degree or 5%ish beer was conditioned for 3 months. Now, let me give you a bit of a history about Pilsen, because it has a long brewing history, but it was ale. At that time, everyone across Europe, except for Bavaria, and a few other satellite towns and cities, everyone brewed ale. Vienna had brewed a lager the year before in 1841, and that's the Vienna lager that we know today. But everywhere brewed ale, and Pilsen was no different. Pilsen had been brewing ale for hundreds of years. Unfortunately, it was crap. It was rubbish ale. We have documentary evidence from the 1400s where a clergyman would write about Pilsen beer, and he described it as venomous and acrid and acidic. Also, from the 1500s, we have documentary evidence of someone describing Pilsen beer. Well, he said, if you was to pour Pilsen beer up a pig's arse, it would squeal for an entire week. So it was a really disgusting brew. I get the impression it's very sort of acidic, very tart, not a nice beer at all. In the early 1800s, Bavarian beer started to appear in the taverns of Pilsen, and the brewers didn't like it because everyone was drinking the Bavarian beer, no one was drinking their local brew. In fact, it was so popular in the 1830s that a Bavarian brewer actually set up a sort of like a warehouse, a dispatch warehouse on the outskirts of Pilsen just to keep them supplied with Bavarian beer. It was that popular. The brewers of the town did complain in writing, but it just got rebuffed by the alderman. And I think this is where this rumour started, this legend that in protest the brewers went to the town hall and threw a year's worth of supply of beer into the streets as a sign of a protest. But it never happened. It's just a myth. We only know about that because of the Pilsner Urquell Brewery Museum. That is the only place that ever mentions it. A historian actually looked at some of the old newspapers, Pilsen newspapers from 1838, and there is no mention of it at all. He even looked at newspapers from surrounding towns and cities. Nothing. It's like the tumbleweed. Nothing. Everything's quiet. No one mentioned this protest. Chances are it never happened. I mean, if all your town's brewers are throwing away in front of the town hall a year's worth of beer, and it says that the people, the citizens all cheered and applauded and clapped, someone's going to report it somewhere. But nothing. Not a whisper. Not a murmur. In all the papers, nothing. It never happened. But they did complain. And what they decided to do is set up their own brewery, come together and set up a brewery that would brew Bavarian style lager. And they put a business case together and sent it to the alderman of the city, and it got the nod. So building of the brewery started, I think it was in 1839, 1840, and it was completed in 1842. So that's a myth, that they poured all their beer or their ale away in the streets. It just never happened. It's just a myth. What they did do is hire a German Bavarian brewmaster called Joseph Groll, who was meant to be a very unsavoury character. And what he originally intended, it's thought, there's no real evidence, but it is thought, he wanted to brew a Vienna style lager. However, they started brewing late September. It had to be ready for a festival in Pilsen in November. And so they didn't actually roast the malts long enough. They were aiming for something like a Vienna type lager, but what they ended up with was this golden lager. So it was a happy accident, or at least there's a strong suspicion it's a happy accident. And what they actually wanted to brew was more like a Vienna style lager or a Bavarian style lager, which in those days was dark. So there you go. That's one myth about the origins of this beer that's been squashed. Another myth about this is that it was an instant success. As soon as this was brewed, the whole of Europe changed. It didn't. It took a very, very long time for this beer to actually get out into wider European cafes and bars. It didn't actually leave the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the 1870s. It didn't reach Vienna until the 1850s. So it was a very slow process. of how this beer actually sort of like took over everywhere. It wasn't this instant success that people thought, and in fact it was the Augustiner brewery in Munich. They famously held out until the 1890s before they started to brew a pale lager, because they just thought it was a fad. They continued to brew their dark dunkels and so forth, and it was in the 1890s that they eventually relented, and thankfully they did, because the Augustiner Hells is probably the finest example of a Munich Hells that you can get, but it took them a long while. Lowenbrau brewery as well, they were the 1890s before they started to brew a pale lager. So a big myth there. Another myth is that we are drinking the original Pilsner. We're not. Joseph Groll didn't start to use, well, Joseph Groll never used Saaz hops. His contract finished after 2 years, and it was his replacement in 1844 that used Saaz hops. Joseph Groll, if you go through the brewer's logs, their hops they used was from a completely different part of what was then called Bohemia, completely different part of the country. They weren't Saaz hops. We don't know what the hops were, but it weren't Saaz. So we're not drinking the original Pilsner, we're drinking the 1844 Pilsner. So there you go. That's 3 myths now, completely debunked. There is one more, but I've forgotten about it. Just give me a minute to think. Nope, I've forgotten. If I do remember, I'll leave a note in the comments about the next myth. But it slips my mind at the moment. But we've got 3 out of the way. There was no protest. It didn't take over Europe, you know, all instantly. It was a very, very, very slow process, and we're not drinking the original 1842 Pilsner. We're drinking the 1844 version. So there you go. That said, it is the beer that started it all. It's the beer that became, you could argue, the world beer. It's what most people think of around the world when they think of a beer. They think of this, a golden, nice white head, carbonated beer. However, that didn't start until after the Second World War. That didn't start actually until the 1950s. And there is one beer, or one brewery in particular, that you could say is responsible for making this style of beer, this pale lager, the international beer of the world. And if you're thinking now it's Anheuser-Busch Budweiser, you're wrong. It's actually a brewery much closer to home. It's a European brewery, and maybe I'll talk about them in another video, and I'll give a more general history of lager across the centuries, because there's a lot of myth there as well. The Reinheitsgebot, there's a lot of myth around the Reinheitsgebot. So maybe I'll talk about that, and also describe how one brewery made this beer, or this style of beer, the beer of the world. But I'll talk about that in another video. Anyway, I'm going to enjoy this now. I've got another bottle in the fridge as well, so I'm going to enjoy these this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy your beer. I hope you enjoy your day, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye bye for now.